Hello and welcome to the session on Macaulays Minutes. Events that led to the Macaulays Minutes. Macaulays Minute was a product of the controversy over the content and medium of government education in India. During 1830s, there had been a dispute over colonial language in the education policy of India. The fundamental questions raised were about the roles and status of the English language as well as the Indian vernacular and classical languages. The role of these languages was considered in terms of their capacity in the diffusion of Western knowledge and ideas on the subcontinent. At the heart of many accounts of the controversy is Macaulay's famous Minutes of 1835. Thomas Babington Macaulay was a member of the Supreme Council of India from 1834 to 1838. His formulation of the goals of British educational policy in his Minute of 2nd February 1835 ended the long-standing controversy between the Anglicist and the Orientalist over the content and medium of Indian education. Macaulay was a staunch supporter of the Anglicist faction. He ensured that educational funding would be devoted to the British model. This decision firmly slammed the door on indigenous traditions of learning. Macaulay's strategy was endorsed at the Imperial Conferences of 1913 and 1923. It had a seminal influence on language policy throughout the British Empire, where the aim of education was to produce people with mastery of English. Macaulay's Minute advocated the creation of a class of Anglicized Indians who would serve as cultural intermediaries between the British and their Indian subjects. Orientalist policy in British India. The policy followed by the East India Company in the 18th and 19th century pay very little effort for promotion of education in the country. The policy was particularly opposed to the introduction of English language education. At that time, education was imparted in the native languages like Sanskrit, Arabic and Persian. Features of Orientalist policy. They did not pay much attention to the encouragement to educational development on the Indian subcontinent. Opposed to the introduction of English language education on the grounds that the diffusion of Western knowledge and ideas might exert a subversive influence on traditional Indian society and culture. Government sponsored initiatives in education such as the establishment of Calcutta Madrasa and Sanskrit College were exclusively concerned with the promotion of Oriental learning in Sanskrit, Arabic and Persian. The notion of engraftment of English and vernacular languages lay at the heart of the company's education program during the 1820s. The policy of Orientalist interwove the company's political need for ruling India with the administrative need of wanting officials who are familiar with the company's rules and protocols. Interest of individual British officials in Indian languages and culture. Through their knowledge and sympathetic understanding of Indian institutions, laws and customs, the officials would exercise power in the manner of traditional Indian rulers. Through the company's patronage of the Calcutta Madrasa and Sanskrit College at Benares, the company signalled its willingness to uphold the scholarly traditions of its Islamic and Hindu predecessors. This policy was intended to conciliate influential sections of the Indian community by demonstrating British respect and admiration for indigenous languages and culture. Criticism of the Orientalist policy. The pace and nature of change that was brought by Oriental policy disappointed the reformers in Calcutta and London. They believed that the Orientalist faction had little real desire to promote Western education. The slow progress of engraftment in the government colleges was ended in manifesting with a growing sense of disenchantment with the wider policy of Orientalist. Anglicized policy in British India. The Anglicist view of education emphasized that knowledge should be imparted primarily in the English language. Furthermore, the Anglicist policy argued that Western knowledge, that is European literature and science, should be taught in the various levels of education. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Warren Hastings' view insisted that Europeans should assimilate themselves to their surroundings through the sympathetic study of Indian languages and culture. This approach gradually gave way to the belief that Indians should become acquainted with Western knowledge and the English language in order to assimilate themselves to their rulers. At the forefront of the campaign to Anglicize Indian education and society was the evangelical movement. In the last 2 decades of the 18th century, they were becoming increasingly influential in the company, in parliament and in British public life. In India, evangelical fervour found expression in the work of the company official Charles Grant. His arguments for the Anglicist course were the introduction of Western education and Christianity would transform a morally decanted society. The adoption of English as the language of instruction on the grounds that it would provide direct access to the superior arts, philosophy and faith of Britain. The diffusion of English language education would lead to the moral and intellectual regeneration of the Indian society. To encourage the study and use of English, Grant urged the authorities to introduce English as the language of government and to establish free schools providing instruction in the language. There was also mounting pressure for the introduction of English language education from middle class Hindus and reformers of India. Apart from this, in the late 1820s, Orientalist control over British cultural policy in India began to diminish following the appointment of William Bentinck and Charles Trevelyan. The former was a reformist Governor General and the latter was a political officer with strong evangelical convictions. Bentinck's term in office instituted a period of reform during which India was subjected to a series of changes designed to convert its culture and institutions to Western norms. These reforms include the abolition of widow immolation and female infanticide, the suppression of the thugs and the introduction of Macaulay's recommendations on education. The Orientalist Anglicist controversy, a reason for the Orientalist Anglicist divide. The circumstance which gave rise to Macaulay's entry into the controversy over Indian education was the interpretation of a clause in the Charter Act of 1813, which stipulated that out of any surplus revenue a sum of not less than 1 lakh of rupees a year should be set aside for the revival and improvement of literature and the encouragement of the learned natives of India, and for the introduction and promotion of a knowledge of the sciences. In retrospect, the provisions of the Charter Act embody some characteristics which were to distinguish educational development in the empire for the next 150 years. By according equal emphasis to Western and Indian learning, the Act represented a compromise between the Orientalist and the Anglicist perspectives on Indian education. The Anglicist vision of a declining culture of India transformed by modern science and the Orientalist vision of an ancient culture revived by its traditional learned classes. The Charter Act's framers did not succeed in presenting a clear vision about the objectives of education. A year after the passage of the Charter Act, the Court of Directors sent a dispatch to the Bengal government offering guidance on the implementation of the Act's educational provisions. Role of Bentinck and Charles Trevelyan in the educational policy. The Orientalists were to remain the dominant influence on educational policy in Bengal until 1833, when Bentinck appointed Charles Trevelyan to the General Committee of Public Instruction in place of H.H. Wilson. Once appointed, Trevelyan immediately set about attacking the Oriental colleges. Trevelyan initiated a vigorous campaign in support of the Anglicist cause in the press. He publicized his controversial scheme to Romanize the Indian vernaculars. He advocated the establishment of British language, British learning, British religion in India. Bentinck was sent to India with strict instructions to cut administrative costs prior to the charter renewal in 1833. One of Bentinck's principal means of achieving this was to replace British expatriates with Indians in the judicial and administrative branches of government. To this end, Bentinck was able to secure the inclusion of a clause in the 1833 Charter Act. This clause suggests in opening up all government posts to qualified persons irrespective of religion, birth, descent or color. Bentinck's scheme to make greater use of Indians in the public sector was inextricably linked to his policy to adopt English as the official language in place of Persian. The gradual introduction of English in the government during the 1830s and the company's announcement in 1844 that English educated Indians would receive preferential treatment in public sector appointments fueled the already existing demand for English in the centers of British administration in India. The Orientalist Anglicist controversy. The Orientalist Anglicist controversy finally came to a head in 1834, when Trevelyan and other reformers on the GCPI proposed replacing Sanskrit and Arabic studies with English language instruction at Agra College. These proposals provoked a deep division of opinion on the GCPI. Since the two factions were unable to reconcile their differences, it was decided that dispute should be settled by the Governor General on the basis of policy statements submitted by the two groups. Anglicized arguments. In their submission on 21st January 1835, the Anglicists justified their proposed reforms by affirming the superiority of European literature and science over traditional Oriental learning. This position had long been held by evangelicals and utilitarians. They argued that Western knowledge and ideas should be imparted through the medium of English. This is to enable Indians to engage in a direct intellectual dialogue with Europeans rather than by means of translations, a process which they considered to be slow and inefficient. However, the Anglicist English medium immersion program was intended solely for the influential classes rather than the masses. They believed that the masses should be taught through vernacular languages. Orientalist arguments. The Orientalists argued that Anglicists planned to divert funds from Arabic and Sanskrit studies to courses in English, literature and science contravened the educational provisions of the 1813 Charter Act. They further argued that the Anglicist plan overturned the policy of engraftment of the GCPI. On the question of language instruction, they doubted if the mere teaching of English language would make the youth of India wiser or better. Although the two submissions revealed sharply divergent views about the future direction of education policy, on few central issues the Orientalists and Anglicists were in broad agreement. Both groups favored the introduction and spread of European literature and science. They believed that the ultimate objective of British policy should be the development of vernacular education for the masses, but this would be based on a vernacular literature enriched by the infusion of Western knowledge and ideas. Both views agreed that the Indian vernacular languages in their present condition were inadequate media for the teaching of modern subjects and science. Macaulay's Minutes. As a result of the impasse on the GCPI, Bentinck referred the education question to Macaulay, who had arrived in India in June 1834 to take up the post of legal member of the Council of Governor General. Macaulay duly penned his minute on 2nd February 1835 in support of the Anglicist cause. Bentinck promptly issued a resolution signalling that henceforth the great object of British policy in India would be the promotion of English medium education. For the next 100 years, language policy was founded on these events. Ideas put forward in Macaulay's Minutes. Macaulay's first task was to address the terms of the Charter Act, because for formulating an education policy, the GCPI was bound by the Charter Act of 1813, which required the East India Company to encourage both Western and Oriental learning. Macaulay concluded that the government grant for education could be used to promote learning in any way which may be thought most advisable. He argued that the vernacular language contained neither literary nor scientific information and were thus too poor and rude to be used as instructional media. Macaulay's case for English was founded on his belief in the intrinsic superiority of English literature and science over Indian learning. According to Macaulay, English stood preeminent among the languages of the West. The important political and economic role which English was beginning to assume in India also provided a strong justification for promoting education in the language. Macaulay sought justification for his plan by arguing that Indians expressed a far stronger desire to learn English than Sanskrit or Arabic. In setting out his case, Macaulay challenged the Orientalist argument that the promotion of Oriental studies helped to conciliate the influential classes in Indian society. Macaulay strengthened his argument by showing that the policy of engraftment was having quite the opposite effect. For Macaulay, the state of the market should determine language policy. Quoting from, "We are forced to pay our Arabic and Sanskrit students while those who learn English are willing to pay us," he stated in his minutes. Having presented his case for English, Macaulay advanced the idea of downward filtration, which proposed to cultivate a class of Anglicized Indians. They would not only serve as cultural brokers between British and their Indian subjects, but would also refine and enrich the vernacular languages. Proposals of the Macaulay's Minute. Macaulay demonstrated three specific measures designed to strike at the root of the bad system which has hitherto been fostered by us. He proposed that the Calcutta Madrasa and Sanskrit College should be abolished, the printing of Arabic and Sanskrit books to be discontinued. No further stipends should be awarded to students wishing to pursue Oriental studies at the Delhi Madrasa and Sanskrit College, Benares. Macaulay concluded his minute with a characteristically dramatic flourish, threatening to resign from his position as president of the GCPI if his proposals were rejected. As anticipated, Bendick immediately gave his approval to the minute. Impacts of Macaulay's Minute. Bendick's resolution. To give effect to the new policy, the GCPI set about establishing English schools in the major towns of Bengal using savings which resulted from the curtailment of its Oriental program. However, Bendick disavowed any intention to abolish any college or school of native learning, while the native population shall appear to be inclined to avail themselves of the advantages which it affords. Although the resolution stipulated that no further stipends be awarded for Oriental studies, it was careful to direct that native scholars already in receipt of government grants would continue to enjoy their allowances. Bendick's concession on these points seem to have been prompted by pressure from influential groups in Calcutta's Muslim and Hindu communities. The resolution signaled a remarkable shift in language policy in that the teaching of English would henceforth be the principal objective of public education. Auckland's Minutes. Macaulays Minutes and the subsequent policies of Bentinck met with a few repercussions. The papers reporting the change of policy arrived in London a month after the publication of a letter by H.S. Wilson in the Asiatic Journal. This was part of a carefully orchestrated campaign by Orientalist sympathizers to reverse the Macaulay-Bentinck project. In his letter, Wilson campaigned a vigorous defense of engraftment with a disdainful attack on the Anglicist scheme. Wilson's ideas appear to have exerted a significant influence on the official in charge for drafting the Court of Directors' response to the new policy, John Stuart Mill. In his dispatch, Mill expressed the directors' objections to Bentinck's resolution. They believed this resolution as a sudden and radical departure from the officially sanctioned policy engraftment. The directors particularly criticized the Anglicist plans to reduce the number of Oriental stipends, to divert endowment funds from Oriental studies to English instruction, to close down the GCPI's Oriental publication program. Although the directors cautiously approved the opening of 5 English schools in Bengal, they were reluctant to sanction the widespread promotion of English language education. Meanwhile, the government in Bengal was coming under increasing pressure from influential sections of the Hindu and Muslim communities to reverse the cuts to Oriental studies instituted by Bentinck. Growing Indian agitation in Calcutta, together with the London authorities' reluctance to formulate an authoritative response, appeared to have prompted Auckland to seek a compromise to the delayed dispute. He was the successor of Macaulay. Auckland represented his compromise settlement in a minute of 24th November 1839. His resolution of the dispute ensured sufficient funds for both Oriental and English studies. The Court of Directors 1841 dispatch might therefore be regarded as a compromise in that it sought to balance the interest and claims of the Orientalist and Anglicist parties, while at the same time lenient to offer a definitive ruling on the language of instruction. Wood's dispatch. Perhaps the most significant feature of dispatch was the key role assigned to the vernacular languages in the diffusion of European learning. This increasing interest in vernacular education was an inevitable consequence of the search for common ground by the Orientalist and Anglicist in the aftermath of Macaulay's Minutes. Advocates from both parties broadly agreed on the desirability of enriching the Indian vernacular languages and employing them as instructional media. This emerging consensus over the need to promote vernacular education paved the way for the policy set out in Charles Wood's dispatch, the so-called Magna Carta of British education in 19th century India. Wood's dispatch reaffirmed that the central objective of British policy in India was the diffusion of European knowledge. Wood acknowledged that hitherto European knowledge had generally been imparted directly in English on account of the lack of suitable translation. He also claimed that the company did not desire to substitute the English language for the vernacular dialectics of the country. Let me summarize the major ideas what we have discussed so far. In this unit, we have examined a crucial episode in the history of language policy in British colonial education. We assessed Macaulay's influence on British language policy in 19th century India. For this, we began by examining the background to the Orientalist Anglicist dispute in the late 18th and early 19th centuries over the content and medium of government education in India. Then we move on to analyze the content and purpose of Macaulays Minutes. The short term and long term consequences of Macaulay's scheme in India were also examined. Now, you can try to answer the questions given here. First question, what were the context that led to the Minutes of Macaulay? Second question, what was the criticism raised against Orientalist policy? Third question, what are the features of Orientalist policy? Fourth question, what were the arguments in the Anglicized policy towards English education? Fifth question, what were the ideas presented by Macaulay in his Minute? And sixth question, write a note on the immediate repercussions of the Macaulay's Minute. Now, you may go through the reference books cited here for further reading and understanding. History of Education in India by R.N. Sharma and R.K. Sharma, published by Atlantic Publishers in the year 2000. Thank you for watching this program. We can meet again with another topic. Till then, take care.